So, as Tom just mentioned, this is now for something completely different. And also I apologize for in advance for people who've already seen this, since I've given this a few other places. Georgi already took off to go to sleep. Maybe some other people want to do the same. So A, it's empirical, and B, it's, although still work in progress, about a year old work in progress. So it's a paper that keeps on giving. It's joint work with Claire Lim now at Cornell. So there is a theoretical question underlying this. Actually, there's more than one. We already saw a model about unbundling and bundling election, possibly, maybe thinking about that in terms of elections, who's elected, what do they do. We're going to study US courts where judges are elected, unlike anywhere else in the world. And the questions we might have to do with things like, do elected judges make sense? Do elections provide good incentives for judges, and so on and so forth? That's a literature of which there's not a whole lot of work, but some. We're not actually going to do that. We're going to step back in some sense and ask, well, so what do voters do when they're choosing judges? And how does that appear to differ across electoral systems? And then ultimately, maybe then that would get us a step towards asking, or answering the question, do different electoral systems get you different types of judges, get you different better or worse judges in particular, maybe, or high or low performing judges in different systems? We're not going to get there really today, although I'll skip way ahead to one correlation which is important because it motivates some of what we do. Here it is. So the Chamber of Commerce is one of many organizations. Almost all the other ones are bar associations, but this is the Chamber of Commerce, US Chamber of Commerce, that sort of tries to evaluate judicial systems. Essentially, all these evaluations, and I'm going to talk about other ones, in particular ones by bar associations and state commissions, they all work in a similar kind of way, which is to survey people. It's really hard to measure performance of any kind of public output at all. Probably judges are evaluated more than anybody else, actually. But the way they're done is kind of subjective. But the hope is that if you aggregate hundreds and hundreds of lawyers' opinions, then you get something about at least what lawyers think about how the performance of these judges is. And then we could argue about whether or not what the lawyers want is what voters ought to want. And I believe, I could probably convince you, I think a lot of the things are the same. Efficiency. A lot of the things are efficiency, involve a lot of efficiency issues, and the lawyers and the people probably should want the same thing in terms of efficiency and maybe also in terms of fairness of outcomes, predictability of outcomes, and then also judges that pay attention to the law. Anyway, the Chamber of Commerce evaluates each state on a bunch of different criteria. One of the criterion, and again, they do this by surveying lawyers. Now, they're actually surveying business lawyers who work in large corporations. Not just a random sample of lawyers from a bar association, but inside, usually, business lawyers. Anyway, looking across the different systems that we have in the US, there are four. Actually, there's more than four, but four, they can be boxed into mostly four. There's, first of all, a bunch of states that just appoint their judges. Where I'm from in Massachusetts, they just appoint judges. That makes sense to me, anyway, and to lots of people, I think everywhere in Europe, they're appointed. Another kind of election is, like in Texas, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Louisiana, West Virginia, partisan elections, where you have a Democrat running against a Republican. Usually you have, or always, actually not always, in New York you don't have, you actually have parties picking the first stage, but usually you have a primary election and then a general election with a partisan general election. The other kind of system that's very common, the most common in fact, 21, is nonpartisan, and that's usually a runoff system where there's an election, a bunch of people show up, they file papers, they get on the ballot, there's a first round. If nobody gets 50%, they go to more than 50%, they go to a second round in which the top two are the only choices on the ballot. That's the nonpartisan system. No party labels on the ballot at any point in time. And then the last type is called the Missouri Plan by some people, and it's retention, where there's first a judge is appointed by the governor of the state, and then every 6, 8, 10 years, whenever the term is up, they have a retention election where there's an up or down vote, yes or no for this judge. If the judge gets enough votes, then they keep the office, and if the judge gets too few votes, then they lose the office, and then the governor gets to appoint somebody new. That's a system that's like a ton of our models of, sort of the random draw of the challenger after an election. Interestingly here, just looking across these systems, just in terms of the Chamber of Commerce rankings, on the particular item, judge competence. How competent are the judges? So you take the rankings, and 1 is best, and 50 is worst. And interestingly, the worst systems are these partisan systems. They're noticeably worse. And the next are nonpartisan, but there you are. They're also not good, but definitely a step above partisan. Then come appointed systems, and they're pretty indistinguishable from the retention systems. Retention and appointed look about the same. So on the face of it, you'd say elections are bad and partisan elections are worst. Now, who knows if this is just a correlation, and who knows if there's anything underlying it. But what I want to show you is that what voters do, it's not exactly consistent. Oh, I guess I can't move very far because of the tide here. Okay, what voters do is consistent at least with the idea that maybe partisan systems are going to perform the worst. The evidence that we would have has a more of a difficult time explaining or accounting for why nonpartisan systems would do that much worse than appointed systems. But there's another difference between the systems, which we're not going to talk about a lot, which is that the one case, always, a judge is appointed first. And that first filter to become a judge is a massive filter. Like governors don't just go and pick people at random from the set of lawyers or lower judges to fill a judgeship. They go with commission recommendations, sometimes they have to, and so on and so forth. So the appointed systems have whereas in partisan or nonpartisan elections, anybody can run. Anybody who has been basically fits the criteria. The criteria usually are to be a judge at this level, you have to have X, Y, and Z in terms of bar association membership, active, you've been a practicing lawyer in the state for at least so long, et cetera, haven't been convicted of offenses and stuff. Anyway, so between what we have to say and the fact that there's another filter applied, this could account for why retention systems and appointed systems do better than nonpartisan, which then in turn do better than partisan.
What's the average turnout in this election?
So the average turnout, that's a good question. So the average turnout is here. So in partisan elections, not everybody, but 94%. So this is a roll-off relative to top of the ticket. So almost always, except in Wisconsin, these elections are held at the same time as like a presidential or gubernatorial election. And then they're just down on the ballot. So in some sense, actually, our work is really about the question, can voters do anything in an election this far down the ballot that makes sense at all? And I think, my prior is no. It's just useless. Like, what are they going to know to do anything? Anyway, therefore, maybe none of them should even turn out. In the case that it's a partisan election and there's both a Democrat and Republican running, well, 6% have gone to the polls and don't vote in this election, but almost everybody does. Somewhat surprisingly to me, if it's nonpartisan, then in fact it's much lower, but still 70% of the people are voting in this. So that's what's going on. So in the nonpartisan, of course, there's a lot more roll-off, and then the same in retention elections, very similar amounts, but they're there are still lots of people voting. Yes?
For the runoffs of the nonpartisan, which there must be quite a few. But
Yes.
Those are held in off times, right? So the turnout.
No. What will happen?
No.
No. Yeah, they'll be. No. They'll be. Okay. So when you have a runoff system, or when you have a nonpartisan system, the the first election, called the first round, is virtually always held at the same time as the primary election, when 3 or more people show up, and in some states when 2 or more people show up, and then
So these are all two.
These are all basically, now we're looking just at the ones that happen to be held in November because there was the runoff. Yeah. Or sometimes a first round will just be held. There is no first round. If only 2 people show up, they just wait. Now it depends on the state. Sometimes they'll hold the election at the primary time, and then the winner just sort of is on the ballot with no contest in November. And sometimes, depending on the state, they'll wait and hold and not even have the primary, but have the second round in November. So this is a combination of first rounds and second rounds held in November at the same time as the general. Yeah.
What does high turnout mean in some sense? So in the partisan ones you have 93% turnout. Then they vote just according to partisan preferences and don't use any information.
Exactly. Right. In fact, that's exactly what you do. Exactly. So if there's a punchline to what we're doing, it's the following. It's that when party labels are on the ballot, voters go to the polls and use the party. And they don't appear to use, as far as we can tell, hardly any other information. In particular, they don't appear to use incumbency per se very high. And they also don't appear to use this judicial evaluation data or ranking information almost at all. And if it's nonpartisan, by contrast, so that's bullet point 2, what I just said. By contrast, if there's a nonpartisan election, it looks, and you turn out, and you're one of the 70% who votes, it looks like a very large fraction of those people, somewhere on the order of maybe 15%, maybe not, that's still low, but it's better than 2 or 3%, which is more like what's going on in the partisan case. Something on the order of 10, 12, 15% of the voters appear to use the information. They vote as if they're using this information about quality, in the sense that the quality, high quality person, which we'll talk about what we mean by quality, but that the person who has a better evaluation is going to get a lot more votes in the nonpartisan case. So we have a smaller electorate, but not massively smaller, not to the point where we could imagine we're down to like the 50 political junkies, who really know everything. Like the judge's friends and a few other lawyers, where we're looking at an electorate much bigger than that. So we have a lot of voters who are evidently, they seek some kind of information, they need some kind of information. We don't even know how they get it, although newspapers report it, so maybe newspapers, and the campaigns report it, so maybe the campaigns. We don't really know, but they kind of appear to get it somehow, a large fraction of them. Not, unfortunately, 90%, which is maybe what we would like.
Do they do advertisement? Are these really contested, like these elections? Because maybe you just form an opinion about the party, and then both the political and the judicial contribute in your choice of being Republican versus voting Democrat, and then you bundle the two, like just vote.
Yeah.
I don't know. So is it something? Is there political?
So.
In these?
Oh, geez, this is way too small. I'm sorry. Yes. There is some of the time. So, in fact, there's hang on just a sec, there's a little more money spent. We know a little bit about the total amount of campaign money that's spent, which is, by the way, very small compared to like the governor's race. But in high judge elections, like for the state Supreme Court or appeals court, and sometimes even for one of the people we're going to talk about, which is the circuit court, but I would say it's maybe 5% of the cases, there will be a real campaign. When it's partisan, there tends to be more money involved, and it's probably because the parties are giving money to their candidates or campaigning on their behalf and want to make sure that their guy has a chance of winning, because the parties have a stake in this now. When the party labels are not on the ballot and it's not even clear who the Democrat or Republican really is, which is very often the case, then the parties are not in there. Sometimes there will be interest groups in there, sometimes not. So there's a huge variance. The modal race has very little spending, the modal race. But the modal race is even uncontested. So conditional on there being a contest, well, now we're in some big range, huge range from $1 million races for appeals court judge in Texas, in Pennsylvania, say, to 10 cents per voter at the spent at the low end.
Two things with respect to the information. If you take the swing voters cards, the more developed version, part of those people that are rolling off are actually informed. It's not.
Oh yes.
So there's, and then the other point is that you don't need much informative voting in order to decide the election in the right way. So when you tell only 2% are voting informatively, okay, but if the race 49 to 49, that's all you need.
Yeah.
And when you tell me 15% are voting informatively, if there is 60, 40%, that is not enough. So are you qualifying?
Yeah. So what I would say is that the times when we want voter information to be used a lot. So let me put it differently. Most of the U.S. lives in a moderately competitive, but not very competitive, local two-party area. So when you sort of average across the population, and if you took some threshold, like say you took a 15 percentage point window, and asked the question, 15 percentage points between the winner and the loser and their vote share, say, and said, in partisan elections, and said, how many Americans live in a locality, like a congressional district or a county, where the typical election is coming in this range, and then therefore maybe just a few, well, this is even a pretty big range, and it's about half the voters. And the other half live in places where the Democrats or Republicans dominate so heavily that the Democrat will win regardless, almost for sure, in lots of cases. I mean, in the typical thing, unless so many voters, 15, 10, at least 15%, say, roughly, are using some other kind of information and not just the party cue to take their decision. So I think, it's definitely true that there's a set of voters for whom just a few percent is all that matters. And then there's another set of the US, which is probably the majority of the US, where just a few percent is not good enough. We need a lot. We need, at least 10%, say, who aren't just voting based strictly on the votes of party. Now, I don't want to argue that we want to get rid of partisan elections here and go to nonpartisan elections or appointments, because we just don't have enough data to say that. All we can tell you is some stuff about one of the costs of the partisan system relative to the nonpartisan system. One of the benefits we also can see, which is, if you like high turnout, you want partisan elections. So I don't know if you can read it in the back, I'm sorry, but basically what this table says is, if you look at the partisan states, so what we did was we collected lots of precinct level data. And then so we have on the x-axis, oh yeah, here we go. Again, tied. All right. Okay, so, so we have the percent Democrat in each precinct of, say, 500, 600, 200, 80, 1,000, whatever precincts. Percent Democrat in a bunch of different offices, averaged to make like a normal vote, like governor, senator, president, whoever happens to be on the ballot at that time. And then we have percent Democrat for judge. And then if you look at a partisan state, it looks like this. You see a cloud like that, and the correlation, the Democratic precincts, precincts that are 90% Democratic or 80% Democratic vote for the Democratic candidate for judge 80 or 90% of the time, and the ones that are 20% vote the opposite. When, on the other hand, you look at a nonpartisan election and you have a way of figuring out who the Democrat actually is, that's a kind of a tricky business, but we have various ways of doing it, then instead you find more like blobs like this. Not zero, you find some correlation, but it's more like ranges between 0.2 and 0.4, 0.4-ish. With one interesting exception. Here's a case, the case of Ohio, where the parties get involved because there are partisan primaries, but in the general election, there's no party on the ballot. And there the correlations are almost as high, or about as high, as in the partisan case. So it's not that party has to be on the ballot, it's that parties, and this gets to the campaigning idea. In Ohio, because there are these partisan primaries, the parties have a stake on who their candidates are, and they're very active in the campaign, and they send out slates. You know, if you ever voted in Ohio, you I don't know if anybody has, but you might have been targeted if you're a party registered voter with, you know, a slate saying, oh, for the judges, there's going to be 15 of them on the ballot. Here, and okay, we don't want you to have to remember 15 names. Here they are. Vote for these 15. These are the Democrats, or these are the Republicans. These are our slate. So that's one thing that happens. What's interesting is that it doesn't really happen, it appears, in lots of other states, like Colorado and Illinois, and in any of these retention cases. The Democrats don't go and say, oh, here's our Democratic judge, vote for him or her. They're not out there campaigning. And in lots of other nonpartisan states, like North Carolina these days, for example, you just don't see, if you go and look at the campaigns, you see a bunch of signs, you know, Joe for judge, you know, vote for Joe, and no party. And in fact, it's really hard to find what their party is at all. Just Google on some judge names, try and find their party, and you'll have difficulty. Unless you go back to like some previous election where they were elected under their same name with a party. So when party's on the ballot, voters use it. When party's not on the ballot, well, they can't use it, although they find some proxies for it. Some voters appear to find some proxies for it, and so there's still a positive correlation. There is one anomaly, which is Cook County, interestingly. So Cook County, the other thing that goes on here is that there are just different kinds of voters. We don't know why. There appear to be voters who vote yes. Oh, it's a judge, okay, yes. And then other voters who vote no. The yes voters seem to be somewhere between 60 and 70%, and the no voters the opposite, roughly. And so, because when you look at the precinct level data, you just see, this isn't from individual ballots, so there is an aggregation issue, but I'm sure it would hold up on most individual ballots. You know, you just see precinct after precinct after precinct, they're all voting somewhere between 62 and 65% yes on all the judges. And then some other precinct is voting, 40% yes on all the judges, and so on. Weird. Anyway, interestingly, because of that, we get some yes places and some no places. Here's just an indication of how little information there is in the retention elections about party, and therefore, which is that in Cook County, Illinois, massively Democratic, although still with quite a few Republican precincts in the non-city part of the county, the suburban part of the county, you see that there's a positive 0.37 correlation between voting yes for the judge at the precinct level and the Democratic share normal votes across all these other offices in the retention elections for Democratic judges. And for Republicans, you might expect it should be negative. The more heavily Democratic the place, the more they should vote against a Republican judge, because what will happen if that judge gets defeated? Well, then you'll get a new appointment, and that new appointment could be, a Democrat. And if you really liked Democratic judges, this is what you do. But in fact, that's positive too. Voters know so little that even for Republican judges, it's lower, but it's almost 0.3 positive correlation for the Republican judges. That's the people who like to say yes things dominating the party. Okay, so I want to skip this next part. There could be rationales for voters to use party. Basically, it could be that Democratic and Republican judges are very different. And in fact, at the appellate court level, that's probably true. There's a lot of evidence that Democratic and Republican judges decide things differently at the appellate level. And there's some evidence, even from federal data, that Democratic and Republican judges sentence differently. When we look at the state level, across a lot of different states, including 3 key partisan states, 2 that are on this picture here, which I just want to skip this thing here, Illinois and Texas. and Ohio, which is this sort of semi-partisan. Anyway, what we find is virtually no differences in sentencing behavior that can be accounted for by party. And so instead of, if you might think, oh, I want a harsh sentence, I want a hanging judge, I go for the Republican, they're more likely to be the harsh hanging judge. And that just doesn't appear to be true at the state court level in the US. In criminal cases, yes. So,
This data, is based on business lawyers. From their point of view, an incompetent judge may be simply bad. So confidence and ideology may be confused.
yes. So the reason I wanted to show the Chamber of Commerce rankings first is, unfortunately, they don't give you any information about individual judges. That would be great. And the reason I wanted to show them first is because, yeah, they almost for sure have a pro-business kind of conservative bias. However, all the rest of these people, that these bar associations, people believe, have the opposite bias. People in the US are pretty convinced that bar associations by and large and lawyers by and large are more democratic and more liberal than the public.
But they would still find half of the judges.
Pardon?
They would still find half of the judges from the wrong party, on average, right? So if I'm a Democrat,
Yeah.
and on average, half of the judges are Republican, I would think that half of the judges are Republican. And the
So I didn't finish my answer here. So what we would ideally like, okay, is evaluations of the judges on competence that come from like a liberal group and a moderate group and a conservative group all, and then average them or something like that, or factor analyze them, or somehow come up with the part that's not ideology, the part that's truly competence. We don't have that because we don't have really a right-wing alternative. The closest thing we have is to a right-wing alternative is the Chamber of Commerce aggregate ratings.
Wouldn't you need individual data for what you're trying to do?
So for what we're trying to do, if we were terribly worried, so in the end, we're not that worried. We're actually not worried that the Bar Association evaluations are mainly a signal of left-wingness at all, because we find lots of evidence that that's not the case. The first piece of evidence is that if we look at, unless you think, first piece of evidence is this. Unless you think that Republicans, so this table tells you one of two things are true. Either, with the exception of the New York City Bar Association, either bar associations are very neutral in these evaluations, because what? The fraction of, Illinois, that's a good one. Where's Illinois? Okay, averaging across all these associations, which is like thousands of ratings here. 2,400 Democratic ratings and 1,600 Republican ratings. The fraction of Democrats who get a good evaluation is virtually the same as the fraction of Republicans who get a good evaluation. And that's true across all these bar associations except New York, which goes significantly, much more favorable towards Democrats, and the opposite in Ohio, which goes noticeably and statistically significantly more for Republicans, the opposite. Or Republicans are in fact better judges, and these people are to the left. That would be the other alternative, that's also consistent with this data. But I don't know if I believe that. I don't know if I believe that. So we've also done a few other things, which I'd like to, which if I have time I'd get to check this idea that this is an ideological signal more than a competent signal. One would be to ask the question, using the precinct level data, is it the case that the higher evaluated judges do especially well in Democratic precincts than Republican precincts compared to the not well evaluated judges? And the answer is no. They don't do any better. So either again, there is not really a huge ideological component or partisan component to this evaluation, or voters don't learn it in any case, because they don't appear to act as if that's what is going on. Instead, it looks more like a shift up, or if a judge gets a good evaluation, it's a shift up, kind of like it's a blob up, but it doesn't seem correlated with there are a couple of other things, but they all point to this idea that maybe surprisingly, maybe not, these lawyers want someone who does, here's what they say they are after, and that maybe they're actually kind of doing this. Oh, by the way, some of these are bar associations and some are commissions, the state commissions. But even the state commissions rely on lawyer surveys for the bulk of their information about how to. And here we see just what they say they are after, which all looks like competence. Now, of course, it could be that even though this is here are the questions that are asked, and of course, oh, Democrat, yeah, good, Republican, oh, low. But as we showed, that doesn't seem to be what's going on. Maybe this, in fact, is what the judges are being evaluated on the basis of.
Just
yes.
to relate the question, one, you said that there is some evidence that the Republicans and Democrat judges behave differently in terms of the sentencing. And is it strong evidence, or they're almost like in terms of what they prosecute, or like how? So, and the second one, which is related to me, did you look also if the evaluation of this institution is correlated with the type of sentences? Because maybe what they like is just a lot of conviction, I don't know, like prosecuting some particular crimes or something, which is not necessarily. Or
say that last part. Who likes?
If there is a correlation between the behavior, the real actual behavior of the judges, and the evaluation.
Yeah. So. Right. So, okay. So, to answer the first question, the evidence we have, because it's very hard to get, except for a couple of states, individual judge sentencing data. Instead, what you have is the sentences coming out of a court. And so our analysis is at the level of a court, where maybe we have 3 or 4 or 5 judges, or in some cases 50 judges, and we know the fraction who are Democratic and Republican, and so that's the regression that we're running. There are 2 states where we're in the process of getting, and other people have gotten, but we just have to get through forms. Unfortunately, because to get the individual judge sentencing data, you have to get through human subjects requirements and so on, because it's giving you individual information. So far, we haven't gotten the approvals, but anyway, some other people have gotten the approvals and gotten the data. It's public data, so we are sure we'll eventually get it. Claire has some data for Kansas. What she finds for Kansas is there's no differences. There's no difference really hardly at all between Democratic and Republican judges at the individual level, but that's for Kansas. In terms of the second question, we also ran regressions predicting. We ran 2 things. One is we have this harshness of the court, and we can ask about what are the vote percentages for people on that court as a function of the court's harshness. There's no correlation. And then there's 2 states, Colorado, where this is from, and what's the other one? Blanking. Another one, where we have disaggregated, in addition to the overall evaluations, we have lots of individual questions, including a question about whether or not you think a particular judge is biased to the left in the pro-prosecution direction or pro-defense direction. And we look at the correlation between that and voting, and there's nothing. And we also look at the correlation between that and the evaluations, and it's U-shaped. So it's inverted U-shaped. So essentially, if you are biased heavily in one way or the other, then you get a lower evaluation. The best is being in the middle. There's one piece of evidence that the Bar Association lawyers are slightly more liberal than another sample. The other sample is the sample of people who, in this Colorado case, so in addition to surveying lawyers, they also surveyed non-lawyers. The non-lawyers are like police and people who show up and testify, and a few jurors and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, very tiny response rates in that survey, especially for the jury pools. Anyway, that sample, probably a little bit heavily weighted with prosecuting and police types, is my guess. Anyway, the lawyers look like they want more lenient sentencing. They prefer more lenient sentencing than this other group. But we don't seem to see either this information doesn't get out there, or voters aren't really acting about it, on it. However, it's true that in survey after survey after survey, people say they want harsher sentences. Maybe when they go to the polls, they're thinking a little differently. I don't really know. A lot of the campaigns are about, the soft judge. Judges appear to fear this, but anyway. Okay. So what do we have? Right? So we've bounced around here a bunch. We've got a bunch of these a bunch of these bar associations, a bunch of ratings, a bunch of, piles. Thousands and thousands. Unfortunately, now we really want to beat it down to a set of comparable cases. We have the notion that, when party is on the ballot, that's what voters use. And now we have the idea that when party is not on the ballot, and second, when party is on the ballot, which is the top two lines, the correlation between voting and quality of the judge is very, very low. Partly because there's not a whole lot of variance left, because party is so heavily used. And what do we have here? So what we did was we took all the cases where we have two candidates, a Democrat and a Republican, or a candidate A versus a candidate B. Because in a lot of cases you don't know who the Democrat and the Republican is. And in particular, in the primary elections, you don't know who the Democrat and the Republican is. You have a Joe and Pete on the ballot. And they're both Democrats because they're both running in the Democratic primary, or they're both Republicans because they're both Republican running in the Republican primary. In the partisan general, and then we just ask the question, what's the probability that the better candidate wins, the higher evaluated candidate? In fact, even more. We're only taking cases where one candidate has an actual quite good, an above the bar valuation, and the other one has actually a below the bar, unqualified, unsatisfactory, do not retain evaluation, a very bad evaluation. So we focus on these cases maybe the cases where we think that the most information gets out there, and also where we really care about the outcome. We've got an unqualified judge. We would like to be able to have the voters kick them out or not elect them. And what we see is in partisan general elections, the top row, well, there's an effect on of about 8 or 9 percentage points. The better candidate wins with a slightly higher probability. It's not statistically significant, but it's borderline. Maybe with a big enough n, we could get it statistically significant, but there it is. And then they get 2% more votes. That's the second panel there. The better candidate gets 2% more votes when there's a good and a bad, or the bad candidate gets 2% less votes. Not a huge thing, and this isn't going to affect very many outcomes, although a very close outcome it would affect. But that's not even, and that's statistically significant there. However, if you go to these same states during their primary campaign, now you see effects like 30% and 24%, and coefficients on vote percentage of 9 or 10%, that basically now a huge number of voters, relatively speaking, 5 times as many voters, appear to be voting on the basis of quality inside the primary. And then in nonpartisan elections, pooling all the cases where we have 2 candidates, one good, one bad, general election or primary election, or that is first or second round, whatever we've got. And we see big numbers here, 36, 42%, 35%. 30% probability changes in terms of changes in the probability of the good candidate winning relative to the bad, and 12, 16, 12 percentage points on the vote. And finally, in the retention cases, very few evaluations are bad. Very few judges get an unqualified rating, having been through the first filter, but a few do. And what we see there is a high variance in what's going on in win percentage, but because there's just so few cases, like 3 cases in some states out of 300. But go to the vote percentage cases in there, except for Kansas, you see 15, 20, 11. You see voters appear to be using this quality information a lot. So the interesting thing here to me is that not that this really justifies, that is the glass half empty or half full. I guess I'd like to see much higher numbers than 0% and 14% in terms of retaining unqualified judges. I would like to see those numbers more uniformly like Colorado's 65 or New Mexico's 57%, kicking out the bad judge on the basis of the badness of the judge, at least on the basis of assuming that these bar association evaluations are accurately gauging quality. So I guess it's sort of, there's a bunch of voters appearing to use this information, and some of the time they kick out a judge on the basis of that even. Yes.
So I might ask you about the campaign, and here there's another story, right? I might be collecting information regarding judges while watching the party campaign. So I'm actually using information. The problem is that the source is bad. So it's not the label that the Democrat candidate for governor is saying this guy is great, and that's the information that I got.
And you're voting on the basis of
Oh,
what you
I
think is
believe-
quality.
I believe exactly.
But yeah, no, that could be.
And if you can account for that campaign, you can disentangle whether it's collecting that information or actually using the party label.
Yeah, I don't know that I could ever get away from the thing is that there's other info. The campaign is only one source of information. I think you have the media, you have the news reports, you have word of mouth, and so on and so forth. I guess I have a hard time thinking I'm ever going to really nail down. Oh, here I'll eliminate the campaign or attribute, be able to see how much to attribute to a campaign part. But that's sort of like on the agenda of like how to get there. The one thing that we can do, which I won't really have time to talk about, is actually attack it from a different angle, which is go after something that we have better identification on, which is what's going on in the media, and that comes from this congruence measure with the media markets and so on and so forth. And we can look at places where the judge maybe is just probably not covered in the news very much, and therefore maybe this information doesn't get out about them, and ask, is there some evidence that there's weaker effects there? And there appears to be in our preliminary work some weaker evidence. We find a bunch of evidence on turnout, that high congruent areas in nonpartisan elections, you get more turnout, consistent with the idea that more voters have some information, and we also have some preliminary results that they also appear to be using quality more. Okay. The other thing is just straight incumbency. Now, I don't know what straight incumbency means. Through the campaigns, maybe what's going on here, in terms of, say, a 20% effect here in Colorado, well, these are all incumbents, so that's just hold it fixed. So it's not just incumbency. But maybe a big part of what's going on in, say, California primary or general elections with nonpartisan is that the incumbency is in fact, there on the ballot. It's not on the ballot, though, from Washington or Wisconsin or Ohio. So maybe, but then maybe sort of voters get, oh yes, he's an incumbent. I heard that, and that's, and I have a tendency to vote for incumbents that I haven't heard bad things about, so I'll vote for him. And there's a high correlation between incumbency and having a good evaluation, which is true. There is that correlation.
So with these retention elections, it looks like a lot of this must be driven by outliers. The occasional person that gets bad rating. I mean, the retention rates are 100% basically.
Yes. So what it is, yes. So on the right-hand side, the vote percentage, there's a little more nice variation because you have a lot of people who, you have a lot of cases where everybody gets 70%, except this one judge only gets 60% or 55%, but they all win. So that's in some sense why the glass might be half full, because you would even like that bad judge to get below 50% more often than they do. But yes, no, that's for sure. Yes. No. What's going on here is that in Arizona there are like 4 bad judges out of 300, and they all happen to win. But wouldn't it be great if those more of them lost? Maybe.
Well, they
yeah.
got a lot fewer votes
But
than they would have.
they got a lot fewer votes, but they still all cleared the bar. Yeah. But no, that's definitely, if you pool this, then it looks a lot more, like intermediate number. That's because there's tons of cases here with like 3 or 2 even bad judges, and so that's what's going on on the left-hand side. Yeah. By the way, there's a little bit let me think. Final thing, I guess. Let's see here. So that's the punchline. Let's see here. What else we have? That's just other stuff. Partisan differences, turnout. Yeah. Let's see. So there's 2 things that I'd like to say of things that we want to where we want to go with this, but maybe people have other even better suggestions. I want to mention here was this congruent stuff. Collecting campaign information turns out to be harder than we expected for this low level of an office, because sometimes this level actually in a lot of states they don't even collect. It's treated as a local office. Therefore, the county's responsibility to collect any information. For example, almost all the election information comes from going to counties, county websites, county boards of elections, and stuff like that, because this isn't even collected by the state, because it's local, even though it's state law that they're enforcing. Anyway, so 2 things. One is this question of, which I think is crucial, and we can finally get maybe a better handle on, at least for a couple of cases, which is the question that sort of underlies like work by Besley and other people, the idea that in more two-party competitive areas, and this is sort of also underlying Santiago's question that, or a sort of comment that maybe there you get really good outcomes because a few people paying attention to quality is all you need, and then the good guys win and the bad guys don't. Is that generally true? Do we see like a nice relationship, sort of like that in the long run, or sort of steady state, or averaging across a lot of time and so on? Do 50-50 areas, especially in the partisan, have better judges than the massively Democratic and massively Republican one-party rule bastions, where maybe you can just get crappy party hacks, just hang in there, bribe enough local officials to get their name on the ballot and no opposition, and win time and time again, or not? And it looks so far like not, interestingly, which suggests to me that the importance of primaries is undervalued here, which suggests to me the importance of primaries, and that study of primaries is not very well developed, and maybe primaries need to be studied, analyzed a lot more. Because maybe, first of all, we showed that there's a lot of paying attention to quality in the primary election, and maybe at that stage is where, we also showed sort of across the board, 70% of the low quality incumbents or low-quality candidates lose the primary. So that's a big filter, and maybe so important that it dwarfs the party competition. Yeah, and I'll stop there.
But on that, do you think that's because of the voters, the turnout selection of voters, and the different types of voters that turn out in primaries compared to other?
Yeah, so turnout there is even lower, and there's even at the primary, there's roll-off. Even so. So yes, I think that it has to do with, I think it has to do with three things. It has to do with the pool of voters who show up. They're of the more informed type, I would guess, having gone there in the first place. And second, I think it has a lot to do with campaigning and stuff. Like a lot of the good guys just are not the weak judges are the ones, there's a clear correlation between having a bad evaluation and attracting challengers, attracting high quality looking challengers too, if you do some crude biographical information. We did that for one state. And that's obvious there. And then the third thing is that it's precisely when you got a weak judge that when you see these groups coming in and actually campaigning against the judge, and they'll do that in the primary and also in the general. So they, in a partisan state, nonpartisan state, so the strategic behavior by the elites, as well as maybe a different pool of voters, could be why primaries do a lot more than we normally think they would do, which might be like, what do voters know? They can't know anything. So when we just think of the voter problem alone, we think of voters just going to the polls, primaries seem like really a bad idea to a lot of people, because it's just too hard of a problem. But maybe there's a lot of aids. Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, sorry.
Stop. Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Thank you.